So, hello everyone, and I'm really pleased to welcome Dan Pratt today, an American photographer we've been studying. He is joining us today from New York. Hi, Dan.
Hi, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hi. As you know, I've accessed your work through Instagram, and that's really the central or key platform for your work. When we think about photographs, and for my students especially, can you give me a sense of how Instagram has impacted you as a photographer?
Sandy, say that one more time. It just shows how Instagram has impacted me.
I was asking about whether, or how rather, Instagram has impacted you as a visual artist and as a photographer.
Yeah, well, I think it's been a tremendously valuable and impactful place for me to both share my work and also discover new work. I actually, about a year ago, up until about a year ago, I had like a formal website where it was essentially the core portfolio for my stuff. And actually, I took it down. And so now the only place where all of this work lives is literally on my Instagram feed. And what I think is really wonderful about it is for me, taking photos is not some sort of formal thing I do. I don't necessarily self-identify as a photographer with a capital P. And so like Instagram is a really kind of vibrant but low stakes way for me to share my work. And also the feed kind of becomes a stream of consciousness of what I've seen, and almost like a chronological record of where I've been. And so if my photos are a way of like kind of consuming and metabolizing where I go and what I see, I often will go back to my feed actually as a way of remembering where I was at a certain time. And also,
do you ever actually print any of your work?
Occasionally, but really rarely.
And when it's printed, what do you do with it? I mean, is it something that you, for example, I mean, I'm always curious just because I'm really new.
I mean, the prints are typically for, I've only really printed for family and friends when they've requested it, but it's not a core part of my practice.
No. But do you have your own work hanging on your walls at home?
No, I don't. Not at all. Most of the art around my apartment is collected from different family members and friends, and most of my images stay beneath glass for now.
Of course, I mean, I'm going to say I think that's really sad, because just prior to starting recording, Dan and I were actually talking about like more traditional methods of producing color, particularly prints. And in your work, I see this extraordinary color quality, a sort of cinematic quality that would really lend itself, especially to large scale printing, something like a kind of Gregory Crewdson style giant print on the wall.
I think colors are so hard to capture in print. There's so much, I've always found them so much harder to capture in print than on a screen or properly illuminated. And I feel like I learned a lot about beautiful imagery and color by spending all of this time looking at the Kodachrome slides that came from just my grandfather's camera when he was just shooting family photos back in the 50s. He was a huge influence on me. And these Kodachromes had this kind of magical quality to them, largely because of the color. And it totally made sense to me why Kodachromes typically stayed on slides, because as soon as there's something that you lose in the quality of the color, they're not backlit. There's like this luminosity that's almost lost. And so I'm always in pursuit of finding like that magical quality to the colors. It's so much harder to find in print. I think a really skilled printer is able to do it. I just haven't found that resource in New York, and I haven't spent the time, frankly, trying to figure it out.
I mean, on this is a really happy coincidence. Obviously, you knew this was coming, that very kindly you've given us some photographs from your family archive. And you talked to me in preparation for this interview about your references. I'm going to ask you about them in a second, but this is particularly a slide that's devoted to or dedicated to your grandfather. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So like me, he is a native New Yorker, grew up in Brooklyn. And the arc of his life is really tracks along with this incredible period of expansion in the US and prosperity in the US. And so I look at his life and I look at the way that he lived. And to me, it's the embodiment of the American dream and all of the myths that come along with that, really lifting himself up and finding his own success. And so I look back at all of these photos that he took, and he really, again, like he had his own business as an accountant. He was not a photographer in sort of the formal or classical sense, but he never really went anywhere without a camera. And we never really talked about it pointedly, but I I always felt that photos that he took and what you see in front of you here, photos of my grandma, photos of my dad, photos of my aunt. He's in the bottom left right there. But he had this incredible sense of just what was interesting, and this incredible sense of color and composition. And so, I looked at these as both a record of my own family story, but also as an incredible lesson in how to be fascinated with the world around you, no matter how humble it is. Right? He didn't kind of lead this extravagant life or see very extravagant things. These are taken on like unglamorous streets in Brooklyn, and on like half dead lawns, and like sort of half deflated balloons, and like the and as interesting as kind of the way it's approached and the way it's composed, and the sort of kind of color and texture that you get along with that. So
Yeah.
for me, that's been hugely influential, because I feel that although I'm shooting in a different medium, I'm usually shooting on my phone, frankly. I kind of come at the world with a similar set of questions and a similar set of interests, often subconscious.
I mean, that's one of the big questions I really want to ask you. And I became aware of the question much more when I was doing my original presentation about your work. Is like, in the moment of actually making the photograph, what are you actually conscious of? You have all these, again, we'll talk about it in a minute, these kind of big named references in your work. And yet we also have Grandpa over here in the corner, who's such a key reference for you. When you're making the photograph, are you with him? Are you with those references even as you're shooting?
Yeah. It cut off for a second. Were you referencing Hopper?
No, I was saying just more that even though you have the big names in your references kind of after the fact, like I am so curious to know that when you're actually taking those photographs, albeit just with your phone,
Mm-hmm.
are you with your grandfather? Are your references kind of present and dominant when you're actually pushing that button?
It's an interesting question, because I think it depends on what I'm shooting and what I've seen most recently. And I think about Hopper as a big, and for me, as someone who doesn't have a formal art background, as someone who wasn't raised with a knowledge of these artists in the textbook sense, um, I find that like first the influences come through some sort of osmosis. And then when I find out about an artist, I remember finding out about Hopper when I was much younger, and it being like a revelatory moment for me, because here was someone who was so established in this tradition of art and was doing incredible work, legendary work.
Mm.
Um, and also I feel it as if like, oh my God, I feel a sense of recognition in his work in the way that I like seeing the world. And so I recognition, like anything beyond before that is sort of influenced more organically or by osmosis. And then later on, when I find something that is particularly inspiring to me, when I discover that artist, when I really dig into his body of work or her body of work, um, I maybe will start to gravitate towards certain images that they've made, um, gravitate towards specific qualities of the way that they compose something or tell stories. And then I'll see an opportunity to kind of echo that or nod to that out in the world, sometimes really overtly. And there's this one photo I took I think it was in San Sebastian a few years ago. There's a woman in a cafe window kind of looking down. I think it might be in these slides.
I think it is this one.
somewhere. It might be toward the end. But I saw that, yeah, this one on the right, I saw that as like, not that it was necessarily like, oh, I want to recreate a specific painting of Hopper's or a specific image of Hopper's, but here was something that like really brought to life this theme that he always went back to, this motif of like beautiful loneliness and beautiful seclusion, and this sort of like tension between solitude, which is usually thought of as something really sad, and like really sublime surroundings. And that always resonated with me.
I think, when I talk to students about Hopper, I often show, I think it's called Automat. It's the woman in the cloche hat at the table. She's got the reflective, it's dark outside. And so many students have quite a negative reaction to that painting because they believe it to be about loneliness, and they don't like loneliness or aloneness is loaded in a really negative way culturally for us. And yet here I am talking about this painting that to me is so exquisitely beautiful because of that aloneness. And when I look at, again, when I'm looking at your photographs, I get that wonderful quietness of being alone or being suspended in time. I think is this other, a very kind of important element. I mean, I'm going to just say, going back to the slide we were on before we went forward there, that you are talking about a family reference and being kind of inspired by your grandfather. Your work to me is timeless because it's gone beyond the time now. It's stretched out into the past. It's like this time is elastic. It's moving in and out all the time with kind of stylistic nods to different eras, different periods of American history.
Yeah.
It's fascinating that when I think of your photographs and I think, well, Dan Pratt's working now. I mean, is there any kind of anxiety on your part that you ought to be shooting things in a way that appears to be more modern?
I wouldn't say that there's an anxiety attached to it. I think something that gives me pause is something that I see that both reminds me of a place and time that might not be right now and somehow still exists in its current form.
I mean, when I look at this photograph, because you close down the frame, when you close down the frame of the photograph here, we're looking at something that doesn't give us the detail on or the purchase on a particular time. Like we have a ballpark because it's relatively modern architecture, but the fact that it's modern architecture gives us scope to believe it to exist in a span of time that stretches 100 years. And you're taking us somewhere, but you're not giving us all the information. I mean, is that important to you, that we have information to try and place ourselves contextually?
I mean, to go back to Hopper, I think what's fascinating to me about his work, and something that interests me, is the sense that you see these things and they immediately take you to a place in time, you in the 1940s, for example. But at the same time, you also get this sense that it could be anywhere. You also get the sense that like you're suddenly taken to something that you saw that it reminded you of in the year 2020.
Yeah.
And I think that tension is really fascinating, that like these images both belong very much to a place and belong very much to a time, and also represent ideas and emotions and moments that aren't really, that are sort of timeless or sort of recur. And so I don't know, there's something really relatable about that and really beautiful about that and really cyclical about that, in the sense that like, although the world is changing so quickly, finding things that remind you that, everything is cyclical, and that we do have like a set of timeless situations and scenes to ground ourselves in is reassuring. And I find that really comforting.
Yeah, I similarly, I find things, timelessness is deeply, profoundly comforting. It's something, again, I think is in contrast to perhaps a more widespread or mainstream notion of what comfort is, like how we build up these kind of towers to familiarity, yes, but that we have to have the full story about everything in order to feel confident somehow. And I really know from your work that I don't get the full story. I have these suggestions.
Yeah.
It actually leads me to this idea that, you know, I'm really interested to know the function of people actually in your work. Like when you shoot with people in your frame, why are they there? What did you put them there for? You know, what are you leading us to? What are the stories in your work?
Yeah. So it's evolved over time, and I think back to when I first started shooting, um, when I first started taking photos, when I first started carrying a camera with me. It was in middle school and high school, and I remember being drawn to that idea of taking photos to people as a way of connecting with them, a way of relating to them, and kind of as a way of getting past the shyness that I have. And even when I was in college, I would spend my free time walking around the streets of New York, really focusing on street portraiture. And I remember at that time being really drawn to, like Gary Winogrand as like the sort of be all and end all of someone who can like really enter a person's space and get really intimate in like a moment's notice and capture like an emotion that felt really real, or a moment that felt really real. And so my work started actually as portraits of friends, of strangers on the street. Often I would like ask for permission if I thought someone looked really interesting. It was also the era of like New
Well, you
York street.
would get caught like Lorca di Corcia. I mean, he was sued, wasn't he? I think he ended up having to pay out in a lawsuit to someone.
Exactly. Say that one more time, it cut out.
Oh no, I was just talking about Lorca di Corcia again. I think Streets of New York and his Heads project. He was
Yes.
sued.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, like, I think that this idea of like who who's asking who for permission, and how entitled are you to someone's image on the street is a really fascinating question. But I will say that over time I started becoming more and more interested in spaces and buildings and the impact that they have on us, um, and things that stand the test of time, that stand for hundreds of years, that are in the background and are anonymous and are sort of um, underrated for their impact on our well-being and how they shape like the paths that we take each day, our moods and such. So I feel like the role of people in my photos has shifted from being of primary focus to being something that contextualizes the building and animates it. And also I think like the architectural photography that is out there is mostly presenting this really idealized image of what the building is meant to be, of what a space is meant to be, and how it's meant to be experienced. And there's usually such a delta between what that ideal is and what the reality is. And so, I don't know, I like to show buildings and spaces, and kind of show the tension that emerges from that.
I mean, do you think of yourself as primarily as an architectural photographer? Or in one way, a kind of a city? Are you making a portrait of a city?
Probably only accidentally. Only by virtue of living here and it, like turning my attention to things that I see every day, and trying to find beauty in a place that I've always called home. And for me, this is an exercise in finding new and interesting things in scenery that's really familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I said in the presentation I made is you're not showing off, you're just showing us. Like you just do happen to live in a place of extraordinary man-made, and you're so I think your inquisitiveness in that place means that it doesn't strike me that there's any complacency about, well, this is the grand New York City, everybody ought to be commanded by my images. Your images are commanding, but again, this notion that showing, not showing off. There's an inherent modesty, which I found fascinating in your work because it's also so epic. It's so colorful. When you use color, when we have these bold pops of yellow and red, they're very kind of saturated. And yet they're still incredibly quiet.
Yeah. Well, I'd never really thought of it that way. I think for me, it's just about bringing attention, and like a little bit of mystique, and sometimes even a little bit of glamour to things that people would otherwise just walk by.
Yeah, I mean, do you find that your day job as a brand strategist has any impact at all on your work, on your photographic work?
I would say that my work and my taking photos come from a similar curiosity about the world,
Yeah.
and finding details and truths and moments that and unworthy of attention. And like at work, a big part of my job is studying human behavior, and often, that can happen at a distance. That happens by going to a particular place and observing how people are moving through it and what they're doing, what they're carrying, how they're carrying themselves. And also it brings me really up close and personal with folks. And I do a lot of interviews for research that I do, often in people's homes. These days, it's often over Zoom.
Yeah.
But, I think like just standing and observing a place can tell you as much as a 3-hour conversation with one person where you find out their whole life story. And yeah, observing at both altitudes, and often like the photos that I take are more from a distance. But I feel like it tells you a lot about the place and a lot about the people who occupy it when you can kind of zoom out and see a little bit more. Not everything.
I don't get the impression though, I mean, this photograph we've kind of already touched on, the woman in the window that's very Hopper-esque. Yeah. I don't get the impression that you're being like voyeuristic in looking at her. There's kind of like a passive looking. So, I think what you're describing though now to me is something that does change a little bit how I'm seeing the photograph, because there's something more active actually, which is about you discerning or you deciding something about these people or this person. Whereas when I looked without any kind of contextual knowledge from you about your work, I'm feeling that what you've done is very, very passive. It's like you've just been there looking without judging. Or
I wouldn't say it's about judging. I would just say it's about attending to, and really, I don't know, finding something fascinating in something that's on its surface, like reading the paper in a window is not giving you much information. And yet, like to me, this moment feels really charged, and there's a lot of kind of quiet tension in it.
I mean, are you looking for that quietness? I'm just looking at the larger image on the screen now, and thinking that of all the people I could ever look at photographs of the Guggenheim, nobody else is going to just photograph the. Everybody wants to get that Guggenheim in there so that they have this, again, an element of grandness, or it sort of does come back to showing off. You're not showing off being at the Guggenheim because of your simple photographing of the. And balancing out things that are of detail with things that are incredibly empty or simple. Are you deliberately looking for quietness?
Yes, because well, at least before this pandemic, the world was so noisy, and I feel it's a survival that's super dense. You kind of need to find places where you're going to focus, and you need to be able to blot out the noise, again, as a way of like getting through the day, and not collapsing into bed at the end of it with some sort of like sensory overload.
But it's fascinating that you're recording. I mean, now I'm coming back to this idea of like a portrait of a city, and the city's famed for its, it never sleeps. It's always busy. It's always thriving. Your photographs, as much as it celebrates New York, it's also a reaction against the New York we perceive often.
Yeah. Well, it's showing you the way that I see it, which is, and the way that I've different than the usual icons that you might think of when you think about New York. But to go back to the Guggenheim thing, and I don't think I've done this consciously, but as you say it, I feel like whenever I'm looking at something that's super iconic, and almost obvious in how iconic it is, I'm interested in finding something about it that I can anonymize or kind of mute back. So to me, like getting the full spiral of the Guggenheim is not as interesting as finding some beauty in the plane that supports it, that front wall. And then conversely, I'm also, I think, really interested in like taking these moments that are really humble and overlooked and elevating them and bringing them to this level that something that's worthy of attention, as much attention as something that you would conventionally think of as iconic.
I think that's probably why Walker Evans really stood out to me as a reference that I thought you may be making. And it wasn't just about it being New York or even the reference to Brooklyn. It was about the intimacy of small spaces, of something that otherwise is kind of unseen or forgotten about, as you say, overlooked.
Yeah.
Do you believe your photographs are who you are?
I think they're what I see. I don't know that they're who I am.
Do you think that what you see identifies you as much as?
Say that one more time.
Do you think that what? Do you think that what you see identifies you in as much as you are identified with the sites of the place you grew up?
Probably only incidentally. I think it's interesting to look back at things that like photos that I took a few years ago, and none of it was ever to fit into a particular style or look like any other things that I took photos of. But I do find that that looking back, you start to discover, sort of like talking to you now, because I don't often have conversations about the photos I take like this. Looking back, you do discover what interests you and what's fascinating and what you recognize yourself in. So like in that way, I would say that by looking at these photos, you can discover something about me that I can only discover about myself by looking back at them as well, rather than sort of self-consciously thinking about it as I'm taking photos.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing that we're like, so we're kind of self-referencing after the fact. And again, it comes back to this idea about, when you actually make a photograph, are you active, are you actively pursuing references, or are you simply present in the moment with what you see, and that what then is the outcome is just the product, or really the byproduct of your actual identity, that there's no hiding in a photograph for the photographer, really.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Again, sometimes there'll be like a very, in the case of this photo on the right, like clearly a motif that's inspired by Hopper, like very clearly. And, I'd be lying to you if I said that I didn't take it, because for me, it was like here in this case, it was 2018 in the Basque Country. I was seeing something that was so reminiscent of a classic image of New York. And to me, that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But often, no, I'm not thinking about the reference as much as I'm thinking about, what it is that's having an impact on me enough to want to take that photo.
Yeah, I mean, I totally feel like I'm with you in your engagement with beauty.
Yeah.
Your sense of beauty, as much as I can tell from looking at these photographs over and over. I engage with beauty because you've engaged me with it. You've shown me it. You've reminded me of it. It's very special. I find it fascinating that you wouldn't consider yourself a photographer with a capital P, as you said to me earlier. Because what else are you? What else could you be if you're making pictures like this?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how someone thinks about the quality qualifications of what a photographer is, right? Like in the classical sense, as someone who hasn't been formally trained, as someone who doesn't do this for work, it's purely out of joy. As someone who is not in the habit of making prints, who only really shoots on his phone, none of those are the classical qualifications of a photographer. And so I don't know, like in the past, I think I've just had trouble kind of getting past some of those things. But I also think it's much lower stakes to just make things and not really give much of a thought about how you self-label in making them.
Yeah, but also maybe you're just a modern classic. Everything else has shifted in how it's made or how it's seen, how it's consumed, how it's projected. So though you might say that you've not been classically trained, those classical notions maybe don't apply now.
Yeah, the rules have shifted for sure, and I think it's incredible that all you really need is the motivation to go outside and ask yourself what's interesting about the world to start making things. So I think in that way the rules have changed tremendously. But I haven't really thought about how it applies to me and like how I identify. And again, like, looking at these photos that my grandpa took, like these images have had such an impact on me, and they were just family photos. He just found his unique way of seeing what was happening around him and how he wanted to capture.
Wow.
I'm going through that same process myself.
And Pratt, photographer, I think what a delight it is to see your work.
Thank you so much.
Photographer with a capital P in my book, any day. Thank you so much for giving us your time. It's so interesting having an insight, especially when someone's key mode of delivery is Instagram and there's not any other information available about that person. So context is only driven by what we see. I think so then valuable to hear directly from you, and especially for you to share your family photographs with us and talk to us about that reference, because we could guess at your larger kind of, as you say, academic references all day long and prove how smart we are and how well informed, but actually what's lying in there behind all the time is vital. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you, and maybe we'll see you in class sometime.
That would be awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.